and welcome back to the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. My name is Torwin Eakins and I'm joined by my co-host Aidan Muir, and today our episode will be focusing specifically on nutrients for female fertility. We're going to be covering key nutrients, some secondary players, and then also wrapping up with a few practical recommendations. Now, before we start, I do want to make a quick disclaimer to acknowledge that fertility is, of course, multifactorial. There is no single nutrient, supplement, or food that is going to be the difference between getting pregnant and not. Genetics, age, your hormonal health, body composition, stress, and of course your partner's health all play a really big role too.
And even within nutrition, we're only going to be focusing on nutrients for this one, just to get like a really comprehensive coverage of that one specific section, because this can be a massive topic and we just wanted to do one area well, and there's so much that we could say. We're talking about specifically through the lens of improving the odds of getting pregnant and also through the lens of having a healthy baby or improving the odds of that as well. An area that we're really focused on is what we call like the 90-day preconception window, where obviously 90 days is an arbitrary line drawn in the sand somewhere, but it's a kind of target that kind of roughly matches the life cycle of both eggs and sperm, and many nutrients play important roles during this window. That doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done before that helps, but like that's a really important window there. There's other dietary stuff, as I said, like there's energy availability, macronutrient balance, alcohol, a bunch of things, but we're just going to focus on nutrients here.
Absolutely. So let's get straight into it. Let's start with folate. Folate is probably the most well-known in this space, and is also one of the most well-established interventions in reproductive health generally. So most people have probably heard that they should take folic acid when trying to get pregnant, and that there is pretty strong evidence behind it. So it's primarily for neural tube defect prevention, conditions like spina bifida, and the evidence here is really solid. So it does also support DNA synthesis and cell division, which are critical during those early stages of pregnancy, and that makes it pretty ideal to start pre-conception. So the standard recommendation here is around 400 micrograms of folic acid daily, sometimes pushing that a little bit higher, 1 to 3 months before conception.
So folate is the food form, folic acid is a synthetic supplement form, and there is concern about the MTHFR gene variant, but there's a lot to unpack here. Firstly, before I go through this, have we done a podcast on that, or was that me and Leah?
Probably Leah.
Okay. And there's also a blog post that is on the website as well that goes into detail. So if you really want an in-depth deep dive into that, we've got heaps there. But I will do a summary here because this is a really important part of folic acid and speaking about this. So unpacking the first bit is that about 40 to 60% of people carry a variant on that MTHFR gene. So if this was an issue at that kind of scale, the standard advice absolutely would not be to have regular folic acid. We have a lot of research, as you said, Torn, like showing improvements overall with people taking folic acid. So we know that there's positives there across the board, but there are cases where it's very arguably more of a concern. So for example, people having 2 of the variants or 2 copies of the same variant as well, and even more specifically if there is a buildup of homocysteine as well. So if there is a concern, there is another alternative option, and that's methylfolate instead of just regular folic acid supplementation, which can get around this. But it's worth noting that most larger conservative fertility organizations actually still have a very strong preference for folic acid over this outside of very niche cases, largely due to the wealth of research that we have. I still feel like it's worth a mention. There's heaps of deep diving that can be done there, but as a general broad overview, folic acid is the standard recommendation in most cases.
For sure, and not supplementing with folic acid due to MTHFR concerns is probably a much larger risk than not supplementing at all. So
there's one more thing I'll say on that as well, because the obvious one that you could think is like, well, if I have the money, the budget, want to get it, what's wrong with just taking methylfolate? And the simple answer right now is it's just like, oh, we actually just have heaps of research on one thing. We don't have heaps of research on this. It might be completely fine. We're just not at the same evidence base just yet.
Absolutely. Moving on to the next one then, iron. So iron is another important fertility nutrient. It supports the thyroid function, red blood cell production, and healthy cell replication. Now, women of reproductive age, we know, are at a consistently higher risk of iron deficiency due to that monthly blood loss with their period. So it is super important to get your ferritin levels, or that iron store, tested to see how much iron you have and whether or not supplementation will help. A specific 2025 study from a fertility clinic in Helsinki actually followed 292 women with infertility and iron deficiency who received IV iron infusion, and it made a big difference. Live birth rates improved quite meaningfully following that treatment of their iron deficiency, and it supports clearly fertility outcomes.
Yeah, so from a fertility perspective, it seems to help, which is great. Another angle is, although we're not talking about pregnancy and we're just talking about like prior to that, I do think it's even doubly important to have good ferritin stores at the baseline just because iron needs get so much higher during pregnancy. So while typically 30 micrograms per litre of ferritin is considered like the normal cutoff to avoid deficiency, another safer target is being at least 50. The next one we're going to talk about is omega-3. So omega-3 has evidence for helping with ovulation and regular cycles for those with PCOS, which is relevant here as well. When looking at research on IVF, there is improved IVF outcomes found with those who have higher omega-3 status. There is also a lot of evidence for it helping the baby as well. So beyond just fertility, it can reduce the risk of preterm births by around 11% for 37 weeks and about 42% for 34 weeks. So it's a big improvement there. And it helps with brain development as well. There's a few other pregnancy risks and post-pregnancy risks as well. So like it can reduce the risk of preeclampsia and also reduce the risk of postpartum depression as well. So I think it makes sense to start at a good baseline prior to pregnancy as well.
And not even to mention that omega-3s are also pretty well documented for their anti-inflammatory effects, which is relevant because if you do have conditions like PCOS and endometriosis and you're wanting to get pregnant, it can help with that, improving that low-grade chronic inflammation, which is why also that, I guess, omega-3 rich diet makes a big difference too. Specifically, recommendations for pregnancy are 200 to 300 milligrams of DHA omega-3 specifically. If you're eating a lot of oily fish, so salmon, sardines, mackerel, anchovies 2 to 3 times a week, you're likely needing this from your diet. But if not, you'll often see that it's added into prenatal supplements as well.
Now, talking about vitamin D, as a common theme, like amongst a lot of our podcasts, vitamin D is associated with a lot of things. So going back to PCOS, it's estimated that around 67 to 85% of women with PCOS, before I go on a tangent, is they have low vitamin D. The tangent was just going to be that that's recently been updated to PMOS. There's about a 3-year transition period before that's like officially done. So I'll have to make a decision on what I call it, but I'm going to go with PMOS for now. Outside of PMOS, so for fertility specifically, the most compelling mechanistic evidence is that vitamin D regulates the genes that control the implantation window. So when vitamin D is lower, on average, the uterine lining is thinner and there are lower implantation rates. IVF populations, a meta-analysis found that people with high vitamin D had around 33% higher odds of pregnancy. So similar to a lot of other areas, it's another one where there's a lot of associations, more so than just comparing let's get a group of people with low vitamin D, supplement them versus placebo, see what happens. But also, given what we know, I don't think it makes sense to do heaps of research where you identify people who are low on vitamin D and then choose not to address that. I think it makes sense to just address that.
Yeah. Vitamin D deficiency is actually something that is extremely common and it is quite easy to fix. So specifically for fertility-focused research, they do suggest pushing your serum vitamin D, which is tested by the 25-hydroxy vitamin D test, above that 100 nanomole per litre might be beneficial. So if you are deficient, supplementing with 1,000 to 2,000 units of vitamin D3 is pretty common.
We're going to talk about other nutrients now, and we won't go as in-depth on these ones just because the evidence base is quite large for those other ones, but I'm going to start with B12. So high folate with low B12 can cause issues with homocysteine, which I've already kind of touched on a little bit with that methylfolate thing. So staying on top of that matters even more. The combo of low B12 also contributes to issues or risk with fertility and miscarriages as well.
For sure, especially more important if you're following a plant-based diet then as well. Next one is vitamin C. Vitamin C is a very potent antioxidant, which plays also a practical role in iron absorption. If you're not eating lots of colourful fruit and veg, it makes sense to supplement with a bit of vitamin C too.
Yeah, and it's super easy to get that one as well, so easy. Choline. So choline also works alongside folate for neural tube development as well, and it also helps with brain development. I actually think this is an area where the evidence seems to have outpaced what is in products these days to a certain degree, where heaps of prenatals still have low or no choline, even though the evidence does seem to show that statistically helps quite a bit.
For sure. Selenium then is another one that supports thyroid function, and we know it's important given that the thyroid plays a role in hormone regulation and of course fertility. So Brazil nuts are a super concentrated dietary source. 1 or 2 a day is typically sufficient to meet requirements.
I looked into some stats on this because I was curious, and it looks like about 10% of women on fertility journeys have subclinical hypothyroidism and 2 to 4% have diagnosed hypothyroidism, so this would be quite relevant for them. Selenium deficiency is quite rare in Australia, but what we'd call suboptimal levels is pretty common. So there's a decent percentage of people still where that is quite relevant. Zinc. So zinc plays a role in most steps of reproduction. In the prep for this podcast, I was going to come up with the specifics. It just got incredibly long. So most steps of reproduction. Low zinc is also associated with irregular cycles, poor egg quality, and increased miscarriage risk.
For sure. CoQ10 is another one that we had on our list, and I've only seen it get more attention in terms of older women specifically when they're trying to conceive. Reason behind this is that CoQ10 is actually involved in mitochondrial energy production within eggs, and that this specific function declines with age. So we still do need a bit more evidence in general population studies, but potentially this would be something that you would consider if you were a bit more mature trying to get pregnant.
And in the research, they're using dosages of 400 to 600 milligrams per day, which is a bit higher than the standard supplement dosage. And in terms of when it's used, it's usually used throughout that entire 90-day window as well. Now, we're going to talk about some practical recommendations here. So I'm going to start in terms of my practical recommendations. So the first one is I'd recommend a good quality diet in general. Obviously, there's heaps of non-nutrient, dietary pattern type stuff that does matter. But just from covering all your bases from a nutrient perspective, I really encourage a good quality diet. I also, in almost all cases, will recommend supplementing on top of that. So I personally will go with a prenatal for most people that covers the majority of these nutrients. And then I'd add things that cover the gaps. For example, most prenatals won't have good amounts of omega-3, for example. So I'd consider adding that as well. And I'd also consider CoQ10 in relevant cases too.
I'm with you on that. My next practical recommendation then, and this will be something that you do if you work with a dietitian, is getting that baseline blood work done. So check your levels, your ferritin levels, your vitamin D, your B12, all that sort of thing to make sure that we can address any deficiencies along with just supplementing for that baseline.
We had a section on misconceptions. Did you have misconceptions?
Not many.
All I had was the opposite of what I just said, whereas one common misconception is that eating well means that supplements won't be needed. The reason why I'd say that's a misconception is that it's sometimes hard to get enough of a lot of those things. For example, the logistics on getting enough iron, particularly once pregnancy starts, is really, really hard, and it's hard to get to a good baseline prior to that as well. Folate is also hard to get to those numbers too. There's many numbers that people will fall short of unless they're actively tracking every single step of the process as well.
My only other little misconception there was if you do have specific conditions like PCOS, endometriosis, hypothyroidism, or a history of miscarriage, this might be when you would be good to chat to your GP or specifically a dietitian where you can warrant maybe a bit more of a personalised approach specifically for you.
Cool. Well, we'll wrap up there. This has been episode 260. Hopefully some of this has been helpful in some way, shape or form. But as always, if you haven't already, if you could please leave a rating or review, we would massively appreciate that.